The golden light of the late afternoon sun stretched lazily over the rolling hills of Northern California. It was the kind of warm, lingering glow that made everything feel a little softer, a little slower. The Bennett farm sat at the end of a winding dirt road, nestled between towering oak trees and endless fields of wheat swaying in the breeze. It wasn't much, just an old white farmhouse with a wraparound porch and a red barn out back, but to George and Margaret Bennett, it was home. For nearly 50 years, this land had been their world. George Bennett, now 72 years old, was a retired firefighter. He was a man of quiet strength, with a broad frame, weathered hands, and a face etched with deep lines of hard work and laughter. Though his body moved slower these days, there was still a steadiness in him, a kind of quiet resilience that had carried him through a lifetime of service. His wife, Margaret, was 68, with soft blue eyes that still sparkled with mischief. She had spent her years as a schoolteacher, her voice full of warmth, her hands always busy, knitting, baking, planting flowers along the front porch. Though time had turned her auburn hair silver, and her hands now trembled slightly when she poured her morning tea, she still carried herself with a quiet grace. And then there was Buddy, their 6-year-old Labrador Retriever mix, a dog as much a part of their family as anyone. He had been with them since he was a pup, a stray they had found wandering near their barn one summer afternoon. With his golden yellow fur, a white patch on his chest, and deep brown eyes, Buddy had grown into a loyal, sturdy companion. He followed George out to the barn every morning, trotted alongside Margaret as she worked in the garden, and curled up by their feet each night as they sat on the porch. Life had settled into a predictable rhythm, one that George and Margaret had come to cherish. Early mornings started with fresh coffee and newspaper crosswords at the kitchen table. Afternoons were spent tending to the small vegetable garden or fixing the fence posts, and evenings meant slow walks along the dirt path behind the barn. But for all the comfort of their routine, there was an emptiness too, one that neither of them spoke about, but both felt just the same. They had never had children. They had wanted to, once, in the early years of their marriage, but life had other plans. Instead, they had poured their love into each other, into their home, into the land that stretched for miles around them. Now, with old age creeping in, there were nights when Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what would become of the house when they were gone. George, though he never said it out loud, often wondered the same thing. Neither of them knew it yet, but their world was about to change in a way they never expected. The night was colder than usual for early autumn in Northern California. A sharp breeze rustled through the dry wheat fields, and the oak trees whispered against the window panes of the Bennett farmhouse. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the scent of the apple pie Margaret had baked earlier that evening. George sat in his worn leather chair by the fireplace, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he flipped through an old book about California's wildfires. Margaret, wrapped in a quilt she had sewn years ago, rocked gently in her chair, knitting a tiny pair of mittens for no one in particular. Buddy lay sprawled at their feet, his large golden body curled up near the crackling fire. He was always a calm dog in the evenings, dozing off after a day of following George around the property. But tonight, something was different. Suddenly, Buddy lifted his head, his ears perked forward, and his body tensed. A low, uneasy growl rumbled from his throat. Margaret glanced up from her knitting. "Buddy? What's the matter, boy?" The dog didn't respond to her voice. Instead, he rose to his feet and padded toward the front door, his tail rigid, his nose twitching as if catching a scent on the wind. Then came the bark, sharp, urgent, and unlike any sound they had heard from him before. George set his book aside and rubbed his eyes. "It's probably a coyote," he muttered, pushing himself up from his chair. "They get bold this time of year." Buddy barked again, scratching at the door now, his nails clicking against the wooden floor. Margaret frowned. "He's never acted like this before." George sighed. grabbing the old lantern from the side table. All right, let's see what's got him so riled up." He unlatched the heavy front door and stepped onto the porch. The wind was sharp against his face, and the night stretched before him in dark, endless fields. At first, he saw nothing, just the faint glow of the barn light flickering in the distance. But then, he heard it. A sound so small, so fragile, that at first, he thought he had imagined it. A cry. Not an animal, not the high-pitched call of a fox or the shriek of an owl. A baby's cry. Margaret gasped from behind him, clutching her robe around her. "George, do you hear that?" He nodded slowly, his heart beginning to pound. Buddy was already moving, leading them toward the source of the sound, a small, shadowed bundle sitting at the very edge of the porch. Margaret dropped to her knees, reaching out with trembling hands. "Oh, my God," she whispered. Inside the wicker basket, swaddled in nothing but a thin, worn blanket, lay a baby, a tiny, shivering infant, no more than a few weeks old. And just like that, everything changed. Margaret's hands trembled as she scooped up the tiny baby, pressing the bundle against her chest. The child was ice cold, its little face pale, its cries weak and desperate. Who would leave a baby on their doorstep in the middle of the night? The thought made her heart ache. George stood frozen for a moment, staring at the infant in disbelief. "We need to get him inside," he finally muttered, stepping back to hold the door open. Buddy was still circling them anxiously, his tail low, ears twitching, his protective instincts fully awakened. Once inside, Margaret rushed to the fireplace, sitting down on the couch and carefully unwrapping the baby's thin blanket. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, stroking the child's tiny fingers. "A boy." George ran to the linen closet, grabbing a stack of soft towels. "We need to warm him up," he said gruffly, though his voice held a tenderness that surprised even him. Margaret swaddled the baby in the towels and cradled him close, rocking gently. His cries had quieted now, but his little body trembled against her. Her maternal instincts, buried for decades, surfaced as naturally as breathing. Buddy sat at her feet, watching intently. The dog had known before they did. George picked up the phone, hesitating for a long moment before dialing. "We should call the sheriff," he said, though there was an odd reluctance in his voice. Margaret looked up, still rocking the baby. "And what will they do? Put him in the system? Send him away?" George sighed. "We don't know anything about him, Maggie. Where he came from. Who left him?" "I know," she whispered. "But look at him, George." She glanced down at the child, who had finally stopped shivering, his tiny mouth opening in a yawn. "He was left here. On our porch. Not at a hospital. Not at a church. Here. Maybe there's a reason for that." George sat down beside her, rubbing his hands over his face. He had always been a practical man, not one to believe in fate or signs. But as he looked at Margaret, her silver hair glowing in the firelight, the baby resting so naturally in her arms, and Buddy curled at her feet as if standing guard, he felt something stir deep in his chest. A quiet, unspoken understanding passed between them. After a long silence, George exhaled deeply and ran a hand through his graying hair. "All right," he murmured. "All right. But if we're going to do this, we do it right." Margaret smiled softly, brushing a kiss to the baby's forehead. "Then we'll need a name." George studied the tiny boy, his heart unexpectedly full. "Charlie," he said finally. "Let's call him Charlie." Margaret whispered the name like a prayer. Charlie. And just like that, at 70 years old, they became parents. At first, everything seemed perfect. Charlie settled into their lives with surprising ease, as if he had always been there. During the day, Margaret hummed lullabies as she rocked him by the window, while George carved a tiny wooden horse for his crib, just like his father had once done for him. The farmhouse, once so quiet and still, now felt alive in a way it hadn't for years. And then came the barking. At first, they thought nothing of it. Buddy had always been a good watchdog, and the farmhouse sat far from town, where wild animals roamed freely at night. A coyote, maybe, or a raccoon nosing around the barn. But then it became clear, Buddy wasn't barking at something outside. He was barking at Charlie. It started the second week after Charlie arrived. Margaret and George had just settled into bed when Buddy's sharp, urgent barks rang through the house. "Buddy, hush!" George called from the bedroom. But the dog didn't stop. When George finally got up to check, he found Buddy standing beside Charlie's crib, stiff-legged, his ears pinned back. He was staring directly at the baby, letting out low, uneasy whines between barks. Margaret sat up groggily. "Is there something in the room?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. George flipped on the light. "Nothing. Just Charlie, sleeping peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling beneath his blanket." Buddy eventually stopped barking, though he refused to leave the nursery, settling himself down beside the crib like a sentry on duty. The next night, it happened again. And the next. And the next. Each night, around the same time, Buddy would wake up and rush to Charlie's crib, barking, whining, pacing in circles. Margaret grew worried. "What if something's wrong?" she whispered one evening, rocking Charlie in her arms. George scoffed, though his face was creased with concern. "He's just adjusting. It's a big change for all of us." But deep down, Margaret wasn't sure. Then one night, Buddy's barking turned frantic. Margaret was already on edge, sleeping lightly, when she heard the first bark. She shook George awake, heart pounding. When they ran into the nursery, Buddy wasn't just barking, he was pawing at the crib, his nose nudging the baby's chest, whimpering like he was trying to wake him up. Margaret's stomach twisted. She rushed to Charlie, pressing a hand to his forehead. His skin was clammy. "George," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Something's wrong." Buddy barked again, more urgent this time. And then, as if sensing the shift in the air, Charlie let out a weak, barely there cry. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. He wasn't just fussy, he was barely responding. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. And Buddy had known before they did. Margaret's heart pounded as she pressed her fingers against Charlie's tiny chest, feeling the unsettling dampness of his skin. His face, usually full of warmth and life, looked pale, almost too still. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, and his small hands, which usually curled around her fingers, lay limp against the blanket. George, still groggy, rubbed his eyes. "He's just cold, Maggie," he murmured, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. He reached down and touched Charlie's forehead. The moment his fingers met the baby's cool, clammy skin, his expression changed. "Oh, God," he whispered. Buddy barked again, pacing the room, his tail stiff, his ears pinned back in full alert. He knew. He had been trying to tell them all along. Margaret snapped into action, scooping Charlie into her arms and rocking him gently. "Charlie, sweetheart, wake up," she whispered, her voice trembling. She gently tapped his back, then his cheek, trying to rouse him, but his eyelids fluttered weakly, his little mouth barely moving. Panic set in. "We need a doctor," she said, already heading for the door. George was right behind her. "I'll warm up the truck." He ran ahead, yanking on his boots with shaking hands, while Margaret wrapped Charlie in a thick blanket. She had never felt so helpless in her life. She had soothed countless children in her years as a teacher, but this was different. This was their baby. Their miracle. Buddy wouldn't stop barking, his tail swishing wildly as if urging them to move faster. George threw open the door, the night air biting and crisp, stinging his lungs as he rushed toward their old pickup. He turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. He tried again. The truck sputtered but didn't start. "Come on, not now," he muttered under his breath, slamming his fist against the steering wheel. Margaret stood on the porch, holding Charlie close, rocking him, whispering soothing words that were as much for herself as for him. His breathing was growing fainter. Her stomach clenched in fear. "The truck won't start," George shouted from the driveway. "Damn thing's frozen up." Margaret's breath hitched. The nearest hospital was nearly an hour away. Even if the truck started now, would they even make it in time? And then Buddy did something they'd never seen before. The dog, usually so obedient, jumped up on Margaret, placing both paws on her arm, whimpering loudly, licking Charlie's cheek. His eyes, wide and desperate, locked onto hers. It was not just worry, it was something more. A warning. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "He's trying to tell us something," she whispered. And suddenly, as she looked down at Charlie's tiny face, she realized this wasn't just a cold. This was something much worse. Buddy had known before they did. And if they didn't act fast, Charlie might not make it through the night. Margaret's hands shook as she held Charlie close, her breath coming in shallow gasps. He was slipping away. His tiny body was frighteningly limp, his breaths barely there. She had to do something. But what? Buddy barked again, sharp and desperate, his paws scraping against her leg. It wasn't just noise, it was insistence. A message. A plea. Margaret looked down at him, her mind racing. "Buddy, what is it?" she whispered. Then, the dog did something strange. He nudged Charlie's stomach with his nose, then licked his cheek, and whined. He did it again, pushing at Charlie's small chest with his snout, pawing at Margaret's arm. And suddenly, Margaret understood. "His blood sugar," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the cold night air. George, still by the truck, looked up. "What?" Margaret turned to him, her mind snapping back to her days as a schoolteacher. Years ago, she had a little boy in her class with hypoglycemia, a condition where blood sugar drops dangerously low. He would sometimes go pale and shaky, just like Charlie now. His mother had always kept honey in her bag, just in case. And that's when she remembered. "The kitchen," she gasped. "There's honey in the pantry." George didn't hesitate. He sprinted back into the house, knocking over a chair in his rush. Buddy ran with him, barking as if to hurry him along. Margaret clutched Charlie tighter, pressing her lips to his forehead. "Hold on, sweetheart. Just hold on." A moment later, George was back, jar in hand, unscrewing the lid with trembling fingers. Margaret dipped her pinky into the golden liquid and gently rubbed it onto Charlie's lips and gums. For a moment, nothing happened. The night stretched out in unbearable silence. And then, Charlie stirred. A small movement, barely more than a twitch. But then, his lips smacked together, and a faint noise, almost a whimper, escaped him. Margaret's heart soared. "Come on, baby," she whispered, dipping her finger again, rubbing more honey onto his gums. This time, Charlie let out a tiny cry. Weak, but real. Alive. George let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Buddy whined and pressed his head against Margaret's knee, his tail wagging slightly. He knew it had worked. Within minutes, Charlie's breathing steadied. His skin warmed, the paleness fading. His little hands curled into tiny fists. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. "Oh, thank God," she breathed. George exhaled, running a hand over his face. "We almost lost him," he whispered. Margaret cradled Charlie close, her voice thick with emotion. "We would have, if it weren't for Buddy." They both looked down at the dog, who simply sat beside them, his job done. Buddy had known. He had saved Charlie's life. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and coffee, the sharp mix of sterility and exhaustion. Margaret clutched Charlie tightly as the nurses whisked them into a room, placing the baby on a hospital bed too big for his tiny frame. His color had returned, but the fear still lingered in Margaret's chest. A doctor, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a tired but kind face, entered the room, flipping through a clipboard. "I'm Dr. Reynolds," he said, offering a reassuring nod before glancing at Charlie. "Tell me exactly what happened." Margaret and George took turns recounting the night, Buddy's barking, his strange insistence, Charlie's pale skin and shallow breathing. The doctor listened carefully, his eyes flickering with something between intrigue and disbelief. When they explained how Buddy had nudged at Charlie's chest and how Margaret had remembered the honey trick just in time, Dr. Reynolds finally spoke. "You may have saved his life," he said. Margaret felt her throat tighten. "But what was wrong with him?" The doctor exhaled, his voice serious but steady. "Charlie has congenital hypoglycemia. It means his blood sugar drops dangerously low, and when that happens, his body starts shutting down." Margaret's breath hitched. George leaned forward. "And the honey?" Dr. Reynolds nodded. "It's a fast sugar. It gave him just enough glucose to bring him back." He paused, looking down at his notes. "But what I don't understand is, how did your dog know?" Margaret blinked, caught off guard. Dr. Reynolds leaned in slightly, as if trying to grasp something beyond medicine. "I've seen trained service dogs detect seizures, drops in blood pressure, even infections. But this is different. Your dog knew something was wrong before even you did." George ran a hand over his beard, shaking his head. "Buddy's always been smart, but we've never trained him for anything like this." The doctor tapped his fingers against his clipboard. "Some dogs have an instinct. They can smell chemical changes in the body. If Charlie's blood sugar was dropping for days, your dog may have sensed it." Margaret's hands tightened around Charlie's tiny fingers. She had almost dismissed Buddy's barking as nothing. Dr. Reynolds continued, "If he hadn't woken you up, you might not have found Charlie in time." Margaret swallowed hard, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "Buddy saved him." Dr. Reynolds gave a small smile. "It sounds like he did." He scribbled something on the chart. "I'm going to run some tests, but now that we know what's happening, we can manage it. Charlie will need monitoring. But with the right care, and maybe a little help from Buddy, he's going to be just fine." George let out a long breath, squeezing Margaret's hand. Relief flooded through her, but so did something else, a deep, overwhelming gratitude for the golden-furred dog waiting outside. Buddy hadn't just been their companion. He had been Charlie's guardian. And they would never take that for granted again. A week after Charlie's hospital stay, the Bennetts finally brought him home. The golden hues of the California countryside stretched for miles, the familiar comfort of their farmhouse waiting like an old friend. But something was different now. This house, once filled only with quiet routines and memories of the past, now felt alive with new purpose. As Margaret carried Charlie inside, Buddy was already waiting at the door, his tail wagging furiously, his eyes locked onto the baby. He had been staying with their neighbor while they were at the hospital, and from the moment he saw them, it was clear he had been waiting for this reunion. George chuckled, kneeling down. "You did good, boy," he murmured, ruffling Buddy's golden fur. The dog let out a deep, contented sigh, then pressed his nose gently against Charlie's tiny feet. Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat. Buddy hadn't just saved Charlie's life. He had taken responsibility for him, as if he knew it was his job to protect him from now on. And in a way, it was. Days passed, and life on the farm settled into a rhythm once again, but now, it was different. Charlie's crib was now stationed in the living room, where Margaret could watch over him while she knitted. George, once a man who spent his afternoons fixing fences or tinkering with old farm equipment, now found himself sitting on the porch rocking a baby in his arms. But perhaps the biggest change was Buddy. If he had been protective before, now he never left Charlie's side. When Margaret fed Charlie in the early mornings, Buddy sat at her feet, watching. When Charlie napped, Buddy curled up beside the crib, ears twitching at the faintest movement. One day, George found Buddy sitting by the front door, staring at Charlie's diaper bag. At first, George thought nothing of it. But then Buddy let out a single, sharp bark. George raised an eyebrow. "What's the matter, boy?" Buddy nudged the bag with his nose. Then barked again. A strange sense of déjà vu washed over George. He frowned, picking up Charlie from the crib and checking his forehead. Cool and clammy. "Margaret," he called. "Grab the honey." Sure enough, Charlie's blood sugar had dropped again. But this time, they caught it early, because Buddy had warned them. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, George sat on the porch with Charlie in his arms. Margaret sat beside him, and Buddy lay at their feet. Margaret glanced at George, a smile playing at her lips. "You know, I used to wonder what would happen to this old house after we were gone," she murmured. "Who would sit on this porch? Who would walk these halls?" George nodded, looking down at the sleeping baby in his arms. Charlie had given them an answer. They weren't just two old souls living out their last years anymore. They were parents. And thanks to a dog who never stopped barking, they had a future to look forward to. Buddy stretched out beside them, letting out a long sigh as if settling in for the night. He had done his job well. And he wasn't done yet. The golden glow of the setting sun bathed the farmhouse in soft light. George rocked slowly on the porch, Charlie nestled against his chest, breathing peacefully. Margaret sat beside him, knitting a tiny sweater, her heart full in a way she had never imagined possible. And at their feet, Buddy lay stretched out, his ears twitching, always listening, always watching. This wasn't the life they had planned. But sometimes, life gives you exactly what you need, just not in the way you expect. Now, we want to hear from you. Has an animal ever done something extraordinary for you? Have you ever experienced a moment where your pet seemed to know something before you did? Tell us your story in the comments. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the like button, it helps us bring more stories like this to you. Subscribe for more heartwarming tales of love, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. And if you believe in second chances, in family, and in the power of a dog's love, share this story with someone who needs a little hope today. Because sometimes, love doesn't come to you in the way you expect. Sometimes, it barks.